The crimson dawn of September 15th, 1950 painted the Yellow Sea in shades of blood and hope. General Douglas MacArthur stood on the bridge of the USS Mount McKinley, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the most audacious amphibious assault since D-Day unfold before his eyes. The fate of South Korea and perhaps the entire free world hung in the balance on this single, desperate gamble. 3 months earlier, the Korean peninsula had erupted into chaos when North Korean forces backed by Soviet tanks and artillery crashed across the 38th parallel like a steel avalanche. Seoul had fallen within days, and now the remnants of South Korean and United Nations forces clung desperately to a shrinking perimeter around the port city of Busan. The world watched in horror as communist forces seemed poised to drive the last defenders into the sea. MacArthur's staff had called his plan madness. The Joint Chiefs in Washington labeled it impossible. Even his own naval commanders questioned the sanity of attempting a major amphibious landing at Inchon, a port city 25 miles west of Seoul. The tides were treacherous, rising and falling 32 feet twice daily. The harbor approaches were narrow and easily defended. The landing would have to occur during a brief window when the tides were high enough to allow the massive landing craft to reach shore. But MacArthur saw what others could not or dared not see. While the North Korean People's Army had concentrated its forces in the south, hammering against the Busan perimeter, they had left their rear exposed. A successful landing at Inchon would cut their supply lines, trap their forces in the south, and potentially end the war in one brilliant stroke. The preparations had been frantic and secretive. The 1st Marine Division, hastily assembled from bases across the Pacific, had trained intensively for the assault. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines practiced storming seawalls in Japan, while naval gunfire support ships rehearsed their bombardment patterns. Intelligence officers studied every photograph, every map, every scrap of information about Inchon's defenses. As reported in contemporary military analyses from the United States Naval Institute, the operation required split-second timing and flawless execution. The assault forces would have to seize the port facilities intact while simultaneously securing the approaches to Seoul. Any delay, any miscalculation could turn triumph into catastrophe. Now, as the first waves of landing craft churned through the pre-dawn darkness toward Wolmi Island, the fortified outcropping that guarded Inchon's harbor, MacArthur felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Behind him, 261 ships of the invasion fleet stretched to the horizon. Aboard those vessels, 70,000 United Nations troops prepared for battle, their faces painted with camouflage and determination. The preliminary bombardment had begun at 5:45 that morning, naval guns and aircraft pounding the suspected enemy positions with methodical precision. But intelligence reports suggested that North Korean resistance might be lighter than expected. Had Kim Il-sung's forces truly left their rear so vulnerable? Or was this elaborate trap designed to lure the United Nations forces into a killing ground? MacArthur raised his binoculars as the 1st Marines scrambled up the seawalls of Wolmi Island. In the growing light, he could see muzzle flashes and smoke rising from the defenders' positions. The die was cast. Operation Chromite had begun. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray crouched behind a shattered concrete barrier on Wolmi Island, his Marines spread out in a skirmish line that stretched across the rocky terrain. The preliminary bombardment had done its work well too well, perhaps. The expected fierce resistance had materialized as scattered sniper fire and hastily abandoned positions. The North Korean garrison, estimated at nearly 2,000 men, appeared to number fewer than 400 poorly equipped troops. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines had landed at 6:30 that morning, their amphibious tractors grinding up the beaches with surprising ease. The feared coastal guns remained silent, their crews either fled or destroyed by the pre-assault bombardment. Within 2 hours, Murray's men had secured the entire island, capturing the commanding heights that overlooked Inchon's main harbor. But the real test lay ahead. As the tide receded, stranding the assault forces on Wolmi Island until evening, the North Korean command in Seoul finally awakened to the magnitude of the threat. Radio intercepts crackled with urgent messages as enemy units scrambled to reinforce Inchon's defenses. The element of surprise, so crucial to MacArthur's plan, was rapidly evaporating. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, the legendary Marine commander, paced the command post established in a captured North Korean bunker. His 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, would spearhead the evening assault on Inchon proper, landing at Red Beach directly in front of the city's seawall. The approach would be narrow, heavily defended, and utterly without the element of surprise they had enjoyed at Wolmi Island. "Gentlemen," Puller addressed his company commanders, his gravelly voice cutting through the din of incoming artillery. "The North Koreans know we're coming now. They've had all day to prepare a reception committee. But remember, we're Marines. We've never met a beach we couldn't take." The afternoon hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. North Korean artillery, repositioned from positions around Seoul, began dropping shells around Wolmi Island with increasing accuracy. Several Marines were wounded by the harassing fire, and ammunition supplies ran dangerously low. The landing craft that had brought them ashore lay stranded on the mud flats, useless until the evening tide returned. At 4:30 that afternoon, the naval bombardment resumed with renewed intensity. The cruisers USS Rochester and USS Toledo pounded suspected enemy positions along the Inchon waterfront, their 8-inch guns reducing buildings to rubble and filling the air with choking dust. Close air support from the carriers USS Valley Forge and USS Philippine Sea joined the attack. Corsair and Sky Raider aircraft diving through the smoke to strafe enemy positions. As twilight approached, the tide began its inexorable return to Inchon harbor. The landing craft, loaded with Marines and equipment, wallowed in the rising waters as their crews prepared for the most critical phase of the operation. Intelligence reports indicated that North Korean reinforcements were streaming toward Inchon from Seoul and the surrounding countryside. Time was running out. According to historical accounts preserved in the Marine Corps' Historical Division archives, the tension aboard the command ships was palpable as the evening assault approached. Staff officers monitored radio frequencies, tracking the movement of friendly and enemy forces across the darkening battlefield. Medical personnel prepared for casualties, while supply officers calculated ammunition expenditures and replacement requirements. Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marines, designated as the Floating Reserve, stood ready to exploit any breakthrough achieved by the assault battalions. Their mission was to push inland immediately after the beachhead was secured, cutting the roads and rail lines that connected Seoul with the North Korean forces trapped in the south. At 17:30 hours, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the first wave of landing craft began their final approach to Red Beach. The moment of truth had arrived. MacArthur's audacious gamble would succeed or fail in the next few hours, and with it, the fate of the Korean peninsula would be decided. The seawall at Red Beach loomed 15 feet above the churning waters of Inchon Harbor, its concrete face scarred by naval gunfire but still formidable in the gathering dusk. First Lieutenant Baldomero Lopez gripped his carbine tighter as his landing craft ground against the rocky shore. North Korean machine gun fire chattering overhead like deadly typewriters. The evening assault on Inchon had begun in earnest. Over. Aside. Move. Move. Lopez shouted above the din as his Marines scrambled from their landing craft onto the narrow beach. The seawall stretched before them like an ancient fortress, its top bristling with enemy muzzle flashes. Scaling ladders, hastily constructed during the afternoon lull, slammed against the concrete as Marines began their desperate climb. The North Korean defenders, reinforced during the day by elements of the 18th Infantry Regiment, had prepared their positions well. Machine gun nests covered every approach to the seawall, while riflemen in the buildings beyond poured down accurate fire on the exposed Marines. Mortar rounds began falling among the landing craft, still approaching the shore, sending geysers of water and shrapnel across the beach. Lopez was among the first to reach the top of the seawall, his Marines following close behind despite the withering enemy fire. As he prepared to throw a grenade into a nearby North Korean position, an enemy grenade landed at his feet. Without hesitation, Lopez threw himself onto the explosive device, absorbing the blast with his own body and saving the lives of his men. His sacrifice would earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously, but at that moment, his Marines knew only that their leader was gone. The battle for Red Beach raged with increasing intensity as more Marines poured over the seawall. Company commanders shouted orders through the smoke and confusion, directing their men toward specific objectives in the city beyond. The narrow streets of Inchon became a maze of deadly encounters as Marines fought from building to building, room to room, against determined North Korean defenders. Major Edwin Simmons led his battalion through the dock area, where enemy snipers had positioned themselves among the warehouses and cranes. His Marines moved with practiced precision, using fire and maneuver tactics perfected in the Pacific campaigns of World War II. Bangalore torpedoes blasted through enemy barricades, while flamethrower teams cleared bunkers and strongpoints. As documented in official Marine Corps battle reports from the Korean War archives, the fighting was particularly fierce around Observatory Hill, a commanding piece of terrain that overlooked both the harbor and the approaches to Seoul. North Korean defenders had positioned mortar and artillery observers on the hill, directing devastating fire onto the landing beaches below. Captain Robert Barrow's company assault on Observatory Hill became one of the epic small unit actions of the Korean War. His Marines, advancing upslope through a gauntlet of enemy fire, used grenades and bayonets to clear enemy positions one by one. Barrow himself led from the front, his calm voice directing his men even as North Korean bullets snapped overhead. By 10 o'clock that evening, the Marines had secured most of their initial objectives in Inchon. The port facilities, though damaged by the bombardment, remained largely intact and suitable for unloading the heavy equipment that would follow. Enemy resistance was crumbling as North Korean units began withdrawing toward Seoul, harassed by Marine patrols and close air support. But the victory at Red Beach had come at a cost. Marine casualties mounted steadily throughout the evening assault, with several companies reporting losses of 20% or more. Corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate the wounded, while ammunition parties struggled to resupply the advancing rifle companies. Colonel Puller established his command post in a captured North Korean bunker near the harbor, radio operators maintaining contact with the scattered Marine units fighting throughout the city. Reports flowed in steadily. Blue Beach secured, enemy artillery silenced, road junctions captured. The impossible was becoming reality. As midnight approached, MacArthur's staff officers aboard the Mount McKinley began planning the next phase of Operation Chromite. With Inchon secured, the advance on Seoul could begin. But first, the port would need to be cleared of mines and obstacles. While the Marines consolidated their positions against the inevitable, North Korean counterattack. Dawn on September 16th revealed the smoking ruins of Inchon Harbor, littered with the debris of battle but firmly in United Nations hands. General MacArthur strode across Red Beach just after sunrise, his trademark corncob pipe clenched between his teeth as he surveyed the scene of his greatest triumph. The impossible landing had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, but the real prize still lay 25 miles to the east. Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marines had begun their advance toward Seoul before the fighting in Inchon had fully ended. Their mission was to cut the main supply routes connecting the North Korean forces in the south with their base of operations around the capital. Speed was essential. Every hour of delay allowed the enemy to organize a more effective defense of Seoul and potentially escape the trap that MacArthur had so carefully constructed. The advance inland proved more challenging than the beach assault itself. North Korean engineers had destroyed most of the bridges along the route, forcing the Marines to ford streams and navigate around obstacles while under sporadic artillery fire. The single road from Inchon to Seoul became a bottleneck as supplies, reinforcements, and heavy equipment struggled to keep pace with the advancing infantry. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis led his battalion through the industrial suburbs east of Inchon, his Marines advancing cautiously through factory complexes and worker housing projects. North Korean defenders, now reinforced by elements of the Seoul City Regiment, had established defensive positions among the buildings, forcing the Marines to fight for every city block. The advance was complicated by the presence of thousands of South Korean civilians, many of whom had been forced to work in North Korean labor battalions. These refugees streamed toward the advancing Marines, seeking protection and medical care while inadvertently hampering military operations. Marine commanders faced the difficult task of providing humanitarian assistance while maintaining their operational momentum. Meanwhile, at Kimpo Airfield, Korea's largest and most strategic aviation facility, another drama was unfolding. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines had been tasked with capturing the airfield intact, denying its use to North Korean forces while securing it for United Nations air operations. The mission required speed and precision, as intelligence reports indicated that North Korean engineers were preparing to destroy the runway and facilities. Major Robert Taplett's company reached the outskirts of Kimpo just after noon on September 17th, encountering surprisingly light resistance from the North Korean airbase garrison. The enemy had apparently evacuated most of their aircraft and personnel, leaving behind only a skeleton force to conduct demolitions. A quick assault by Marine rifle squads prevented the destruction of the main runway, though several hangars and fuel storage facilities were damaged by enemy explosives. As referenced in declassified Central Intelligence Agency reports from this period, the capture of Kimpo Airfield represented a strategic victory of enormous proportions. Within hours of its seizure, United Nations transport aircraft were landing supplies and reinforcements, while fighter bombers began operating from the Korean mainland for the first time since the war began. The psychological impact of the Inchon landing was becoming apparent as reports reached MacArthur's headquarters of North Korean units abandoning their positions along the Pusan perimeter. The 8th Army, under Lieutenant General Walton Walker, prepared to break out of their defensive positions and link up with the Marines advancing from Inchon. The entire strategic situation on the Korean peninsula was being transformed in a matter of days. But North Korean resistance was stiffening as the Marines approached Seoul's outer defenses. Kim Il-sung had ordered his forces to defend the capital at all costs, recognizing that its loss would mean the collapse of his invasion of South Korea. Fresh troops, including elements of the North Korean Guards Division, were rushed to Seoul from positions along the Chinese border. The Marines found themselves facing increasingly sophisticated defensive positions as they advanced toward the capital. North Korean engineers had constructed elaborate bunker systems, complete with interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered artillery concentrations. The easy victories of the first 2 days were giving way to harder, more costly fighting. Colonel Puller's 1st Marines encountered their first serious resistance at the village of Sosa, halfway between Inchon and Seoul. North Korean defenders dug in among the houses and rice paddies, fought with desperate determination. The battle for Sosa lasted 6 hours and cost the Marines nearly 50 casualties before the village was finally secured. The ancient city of Seoul sprawled across both banks of the Han River like a sleeping giant, its traditional Korean architecture mixed with modern buildings constructed during the Japanese occupation. By September 20th, The city had become a fortress, ringed with defensive positions that the North Korean command hoped would halt the Marine advance and preserve their hold on South Korea. Colonel Louis Puller's 1st Marines approached Seoul. From the southwest, their advance slowed by increasingly fierce resistance from North Korean defenders who had constructed elaborate defensive positions among the city's suburbs. Every street corner became a potential ambush site, every building a fortress that had to be cleared room by room. The urban warfare that followed would test Marine training and resolve to its limits. The North Korean defenders had learned hard lessons from their defeats at Inchon and Kimpo. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions, they employed mobile tactics, striking at Marine columns and then melting away into the maze of streets and alleyways. Snipers positioned in high buildings picked off unwary Marines, while small teams armed with grenades and submachine guns launched hit-and-run attacks against supply convoys. Major Edwin Simmons led his battalion through the Yangdongpo district, the industrial heart of Seoul, located on the south bank of the Han River. The area's factories and warehouses provided excellent defensive positions for North Korean forces, who had turned the district into a virtual fortress. Machine gun nests commanded every approach, while mortar teams rained down fire from concealed positions among the industrial buildings. The battle for Yongdongpo became one of the most bitter engagements of the Korean War. For 3 days, Marines fought from building to building, floor by floor, using grenades, flamethrowers, and sheer determination to root out North Korean defenders. The district's narrow streets filled with smoke and debris as the fighting raged around the clock. Captain Robert Barrow's company assault on Hill 294, a commanding piece of terrain overlooking the Han River, exemplified the type of fighting that characterized the battle for Seoul. North Korean defenders had fortified the hill with bunkers and trenches, creating a defensive position that could only be taken by direct assault. Barrow's Marines attacked upslope through a storm of enemy fire, losing nearly half their strength before finally reaching the summit. As documented in contemporary United Nations Command Situation reports, the fighting around Seoul was complicated by the presence of thousands of civilians trapped in the city. Many had been unable to evacuate before the battle began, while others had been forcibly detained by North Korean forces as human shields. Marine commanders faced the difficult task of distinguishing between combatants and civilians while maintaining their operational momentum. The 7th Marines, advancing from the north, encountered similar resistance as they approached Seoul's outer defenses. North Korean forces had established blocking positions along all the major approaches to the city, forcing the Marines to fight their way through carefully prepared killing zones. Artillery fire, directed by observers positioned on Seoul's many hills, fell among the advancing Marines with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis discovered that conventional tactics were inadequate for the type of fighting his battalion faced in Seoul's northern suburbs. The close terrain and elaborate North Korean defensive positions negated many of the advantages that Marines had enjoyed during the initial landing. Innovation and improvisation became essential as small unit leaders adapted their tactics to the urban environment. Marine engineers played a crucial role in the advance on Seoul, using demolitions to clear obstacles and create new routes of advance when the main roads became impassable. Tank infantry teams proved particularly effective, with Marine Sherman tanks providing direct fire support for rifle squads assaulting fortified positions. The coordination required between different types of units tested Marine training and leadership at every level. By September 23rd, Marine units had reached the outskirts of Seoul proper, establishing positions along the hills that surrounded the city center. The North Korean command, recognizing that their position was becoming untenable, began preparations for a fighting withdrawal across the Han River. But Kim Il-sung's orders were clear: Seoul must be defended to the last man. The stage was set for the final assault on South Korea's capital. A battle that would determine not only the fate of Seoul, but the future of the entire Korean peninsula. The Marines had come far since their desperate landing at Inchon 8 days earlier, but their greatest test still lay ahead in the streets and buildings of one of Asia's great cities. The morning mist of September 25th hung over Seoul like a shroud as the 1st Marine Division prepared for its final assault on South Korea's ancient capital. 8 months of North Korean occupation had transformed the city into a maze of barricades, strongpoints, and booby traps. Every street intersection, every government building, every school had been turned into a fortress by defenders who knew that the loss of Seoul would mean the collapse of their invasion. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Sutter's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines moved through the Mapo district in the pre-dawn darkness. Their objective, the massive government general building that had served as the seat of power during Japanese rule and now housed the North Korean occupation headquarters. The building's thick walls and commanding position made it a natural fortress, bristling with machine guns and defended by elite North Korean troops. The urban combat that followed was unlike anything the Marines had experienced, even during the bloody Pacific campaigns of World War II. North Korean defenders had prepared interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to their positions. Snipers, positioned in buildings throughout the city, picked off Marines with deadly precision. Booby traps, improvised from artillery shells and mining equipment, claimed additional casualties among the advancing rifle companies. Captain John Stevens led his company through the narrow streets of the Yung district, where traditional Korean houses with their distinctive curved roofs provided cover for both attackers and defenders. His Marines moved in small teams, using grenades and automatic weapons to clear each building methodically. The fighting was exhausting, requiring constant vigilance against enemies who could appear anywhere, at any time. The battle for Seoul's Central Railway Station became an epic encounter that lasted nearly 6 hours. North Korean engineers had fortified the building extensively, creating firing positions among the ticket windows and platforms. Major Frank Kerr's battalion attacked the station from 3 directions simultaneously, using flamethrowers to clear the main concourse, while rifle squads fought through the administrative offices and baggage areas. Marine casualties mounted steadily as the urban fighting intensified. Corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate the wounded through streets swept by enemy fire, while ammunition parties struggled to resupply the rifle companies engaged in close combat. The narrow streets made it difficult to bring up tanks and heavy weapons, forcing the Marines to rely primarily on individual weapons and small unit tactics. Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marines, advancing from the north, encountered similar resistance as they fought toward the Han River bridges. North Korean defenders had prepared the bridges for demolition, planning to destroy these vital crossing points if their position in Seoul became untenable. Marine engineers worked under fire to locate and neutralize the explosive charges before they could be detonated. As reported in contemporary Stars and Stripes military newspaper accounts, the fighting in Seoul was characterized by its intensity and the determination shown by both sides. North Korean defenders, many of them veterans of campaigns in China and Manchuria, fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant the end of their cause. Marines responded with the aggressive tactics and superior training that had made them legendary throughout the Pacific. The psychological warfare aspect of the battle became increasingly important as the fighting progressed. Marine loudspeaker teams broadcast surrender appeals in Korean, while leaflets dropped by. Aircraft promised fair treatment for North Korean soldiers who abandoned their positions. Some enemy units began to surrender in small groups, but the majority continued to fight with fanatical determination. By midday on September 26th, Marine units had fought their way to within sight of the Han River, the natural barrier that divided Seoul into northern and southern districts. The bridges across the river remained intact, But North Korean engineers stood ready to destroy them at the first sign that their positions were becoming untenable. The race was on to secure these vital crossing points before they could be demolished. The battle for Namsan Hill, Seoul's highest point and the site of the city's ancient fortress walls, became a symbol of the entire campaign. North Korean forces had established their final command post on the hill, determined to make their last stand among the ruins of Korea's medieval fortifications. The assault on Namsan would require every ounce of Marine courage and skill, as the defenders had turned the ancient fortress into a modern stronghold. As evening approached, the sounds of battle echoed through Seoul's empty streets, while smoke rose from dozens of burning buildings. The liberation of South Korea's capital was within reach, but the final victory would require one more supreme effort from the Marines, who had come so far since their desperate landing at Inchon 11 days earlier. The ancient bronze bell of Bosingak, Seoul's traditional timekeeper, had fallen silent during the months of North Korean occupation, its voice stilled by the weight of conquest. At 14:30 hours on September 27, 1950, as Marine units converged on the city center from multiple directions, the bell would ring again, not by human hands, but by the concussion of a North Korean demolition charge that marked the enemy's final act of defiance before withdrawing across the Han River. Colonel Louis Puller stood amid the rubble of what had once been Seoul's main post office, his weathered face streaked with smoke and dust as he surveyed the scene of ultimate victory. Around him, Marines methodically cleared the remaining pockets of North Korean resistance, their movements professional and efficient, despite 11 days of continuous combat. The impossible had been achieved. Seoul was free. The final North Korean withdrawal had begun at dawn, as surviving elements of the Seoul City Regiment and the 18th Infantry Regiment attempted to escape across the Han River bridges before Marine units could cut off their retreat. But Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marines had anticipated this move, positioning themselves to command the northern approaches to the bridges while artillery observers called down devastating fire on the crowded crossing points. The destruction was terrible to behold. North Korean vehicles, packed with fleeing soldiers and equipment, jammed the bridges as Marine artillery found the range. Secondary explosions lit the morning sky as ammunition trucks detonated, while the Han River below filled with debris and desperate swimmers attempting to reach the northern shore. The retreat became a rout, then a massacre. Captain Robert Barrow's company reached the steps of the Capitol building, South Korea's symbol of democratic government, just as the last North Korean defenders abandoned their positions. The building had been extensively damaged during the fighting, its classical columns chipped by bullet strikes and its windows blown out by concussion. But the structure remained intact, a testament to both Korean craftsmanship and Marine determination. Human cost of the Seoul campaign was becoming apparent as casualty reports reached division headquarters. The 1st Marine Division had suffered over 500 killed and wounded during the 11-day operation, with some rifle companies reporting losses exceeding 50%. The price of victory had been paid in blood by young Americans who would never see their homes again, but the strategic victory was complete and overwhelming. As documented in official Department of Defense after-action reports, the Inchon landing and subsequent capture of Seoul had destroyed the North Korean People's Army as an effective fighting force. Cut off from their supplies and reinforcements, the North Korean units trapped in the south began surrendering in large numbers, or simply melting away into the countryside. Lieutenant General Walton Walker's 8th Army, breaking out of the Pusan perimeter on September 23, had linked up with Marine Patrol south of Seoul on September 26. The junction of these two forces marked the effective end of North Korean resistance in South Korea. Kim Il-sung's grand invasion had collapsed in the face of MacArthur's brilliant, strategic counterstr. The liberation of Seoul was marked by Scenes of incredible joy and relief among the South Korean population. Civilians who had hidden in cellars and basements during the fighting emerged to greet their liberators with tears of gratitude. Korean flags, hidden during months of occupation, appeared in windows throughout the city. The ancient capital was free once again. General MacArthur arrived in Seoul on September 29, exactly 3 months after the North Korean invasion had begun. In a ceremony held at the damaged Capitol building, he formally returned the city to President Syngman Rhee and the South Korean government. The old general's words echoed through the ruins. By the grace of a merciful providence, our forces fighting under the standard of that greatest hope and inspiration of mankind, the United Nations, have liberated this ancient capital city of Korea. But even as the victory celebrations began, MacArthur was already planning the next phase of his campaign. North Korean forces were retreating toward the 38th parallel and beyond, but the general had no intention of stopping at the original border. The opportunity existed to unify Korea under South Korean leadership, and MacArthur was determined to seize it. The Battle of Inchon had indeed been the lightning strike that reversed the tide of the Korean War. In 11 days of brilliant planning and courageous execution, MacArthur and his Marines had transformed certain defeat into stunning victory. But the war itself was far from over. Chinese volunteers were already crossing the Yalu River in increasing numbers, and the conflict that had begun as a police action would soon escalate into something far more dangerous and destructive. The bell of Bazingak had rung again, its voice carrying across the liberated city like a herald of freedom. But in the distance, other bells were tolling warning bells that spoke of greater trials yet to come in the land of the morning calm.